This is a stack of 30-something-year-old floppy disks. A workmate gave them to me and asked if I could save his thesis from them. And well, that is exactly why I have a KryoFlux to save old floppy disks. It also gave me the motivational push I needed to finally tackle a maker project I've had in mind for ages. Building a proper mounting rig so I no longer have to deal with this flying mess of cables, adapters, power leads and floppy drives. Retrocomputing is the use of older computer hardware and software in modern times. I'm the vintage collector and these are my stories. Before we get into the build, let me briefly explain what the KryoFlux actually is. A KryoFlux is a USB floppy drive controller for modern computers, but unlike a normal USB floppy drive, it is not limited to reading standard PC-based formats. Instead of only reading file systems and files, it can record the low-level magnetic timing patterns from the disk. That makes it useful for old computer formats, damaged disks or disks with copy protection, where a normal floppy controller or operating system level access may simply give up. In practice, it lets me connect a real floppy drive, even very old 8-inch drives, to a modern machine. Later in the video, once the rig is finished, we will actually use the KryoFlux on those Thesis disks. Then I will also show a bit more of what it captures technically and why that is different from just copying files from a floppy. But first we need to turn this into something a little less chaotic. On the usual places, like Thingiverse, you can find several ready-made 3D models for building an elegant KryoFlux setup yourself, from self-contained enclosures to simple cases just for the KryoFlux board. But that is not what I had in mind. I was thinking more into the direction of an industrial-looking open-frame rig, which still gives me direct access to the components and allows me to easily swap the drives if needed. So I was clearly not starting with a finished design. I had to grow into the idea, including reprinting the occasional parts here and there. And if it hadn't been for this journey, I would have asked PCBWay right away to have it printed for me. But of course, that only makes sense once you have a design that works, or once you need a result that is cleaner, stronger, or made from material you do not normally print at home. Most people know PCBWay for PCB manufacturing, but they also offer PCB assembly, CNC machining, sheet metal fabrication, and rapid prototyping services such as 3D printing with many different materials and processes. So while the parts in this episode came from my own printer, I have used PCBWay before for other projects, and we will see some new parts produced by PCBWay in another upcoming episode soon. So thank you again to PCBWay for supporting this episode. Originally, I had hoped to build something like a miniaturized rack, but 10-inch was definitely too wide. So the choice was either to build a custom 7-inch rack or to make something even more customized. Of course, a rack would offer a lot of flexibility, but I do not expect to shuffle components around very often, except for swapping drives, and for those I'm using inner mounting frames anyway. So I went with this cubic frame structure instead. I could have printed this as one single piece, but I decided to split it because I didn't want to waste lots of material on support structures. Of course, that means I had to mount the two frame elements together using superglue and a few extra screws. For the corner reinforcements, I could have also used screws, but I simply glued them in place because, to be fair, I mostly added those for the looks, not so much for the function. The mounting bracket for the disk drives is actually not my original design. It came from Thingiverse, but I made some minor adjustments to fit my particular setup. The mounting bracket for the KryoFlux board, on the other hand, is my own. But as you can see here, my first print went into spaghetti mode towards the end, so I had to reprint it once more, but that second print came out fine. The carrying handles, for which I again borrowed the design from Thingiverse, did not quite work yet for properly seating the screws, so I had to make a small modification to adapt them to the frame structure. For the corners, I also printed some more decorative than functional corner pieces. Some of them have a recess to hide the screw heads. And this is how the assembled rig looks with all the inner mounting frames installed. Now it's time to add all the components. You may wonder why I added those small openings on the mounting bracket for the KryoFlux board. This is easily explained. They are for velcro straps and zip ties to provide a secure seat not only for the power supply but also to keep the cables neatly in place. Yes, I really hate loose cables. Now, the KryoFlux board has a series of jumpers that you need to set for the proper configuration. With my new mounting rig, I definitely plan to run the KryoFlux in a 2-drive configuration, so there is no need to keep tampering with those jumpers up there. But I can definitely see myself switching the KryoFlux between read-only and read-write mode, so push-button switch it is. As you can see, I added these honeycomb cutouts to the sidewall. And in fact, adding the switch sideways came quite late into the process. As a consequence, I printed some small inserts that allow me to mount the push button sideways into one of the honeycomb cutouts for the last finishing touch before we put it to use. For the disk recovery, I'm using the KryoFlux software on the Mac, but of course KryoFlux also runs on Windows and Linux. Now, before doing this procedure with valuable disks, it is always worth both calibrating and testing the drive first with a known expendable disk. I'll be reading the disks just as plain MFM sector images, essentially not saving the full raw stream files for every disk here. This is usually good enough for any random PC formatted floppy disk. You won't usually get a green readout on those. Orange, marked as H, which KryoFlux calls good plus modified, is the usual thing here. There is nothing wrong about that, as it was read successfully, but KryoFlux noticed that one or more sectors were changed after the disk was originally formatted or mastered. In fact, this is exactly what you would expect from disks that were actually used, saved to, and modified over time. A less encouraging example is this disk here. Instead of useful tracks, KryoFlux reported only unknown. Strictly speaking, unknown can also mean that the format selection is wrong or that the track is unformatted. But in this case, with these being known DOS formatted disks, it is a very good sign that the disks are simply no longer readable. Luckily, this was the case for only 2 out of 19 disks. And this is exactly where flux level preservation becomes useful. At the lowest level, a floppy disk does not really store files, it stores magnetic transitions. A normal floppy controller reads those transitions and tries to turn them into tracks and sectors in a format it understands. Only after that does the operating system deal with file systems, files and directories. So instead of just saving into system-readable sector images, KryoFlux records the timing of those magnetic transitions in the first place and can optionally save them as stream files. Those stream files are not necessarily convenient to browse directly, but they're very useful for preservation, because you can decode them again later, possibly with different settings, without reading the physical disk again. So I recaptured those 2 failed floppies again into both raw stream files and sector images, but to no avail. I didn't particularly bother, as I was told that most of the disks were incremental backup copies anyway, so chance was very high nothing important was lost as long as I could read out most of them. Finally, I expanded each image into its own folder. This can be done with a tool like WinImage. On the command line, 7-zip can do the job as well, and it is actually easier to use here than the traditional M tools. But of course, that is another option too. This way, I could give my workmate both versions, the original disk images for preservation and the extracted files ready to browse right away. Besides saving random old floppy disks, KryoFlux or alternatives like GreaseWeasel, Flux Engine and others are usually used for a slightly more formal purpose. Archiving old historic software, like this 1993 copy of Vertisoft Space Manager which I just snagged off eBay. As you can see, it's still sealed in shrink wrap. Well, shrink wrap can be a beast, because the plastic film continues to contract over time. Environmental heat fluctuations and other factors cause the plastic molecules to tighten further, which can eventually warp or damage items during long-term storage. And that was clearly the case here as well. The box basically fell apart right away when removing the shrink wrap because the glue had dissolved over the years. It is also interesting to see how the box was basically empty apart from a huge piece of polystyrene foam used as a filler, a very thin booklet and the 2 floppy disks. Of course, I went on to read out the floppy disks, this time capturing both raw stream files and sector images. And you may notice how KryoFlux reports some unknown tracks here. In my opinion, these are probably not unreadable sectors. They may be deliberately empty, possibly related to copy protection. This definitely needs some further investigation from my side. But that's exactly where flux level readouts become useful. With KryoFlux, you can fully preserve these oddities, allowing you to also recreate bit-accurate disk copies later. That is something you would not normally get from DOS's disk copy, because disk copy expects a fairly standard disk layout. It copies what the floppy disk controller and the operating system understands, but not necessarily every odd pattern that might exist on the original disk. Now, if you are already longing for a closer look at Space Manager, or even this obscure 1987 preview copy of Wendy in DOS, then stay tuned for this year's advent calendar, coming December 1st, 2026, where those will be finally revealed. How about you? Have you ever tried to recover or preserve old floppy disks yourself, and what was your experience? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy my ventures into retro computing, tinkering, preservation, repairs and explorations, then subscribing to the channel or even becoming a channel member is always appreciated. I'm the Vintage Collector, and this was my story for today. Thanks for watching, and see you again next Sunday.